Hello everyone, welcome to the CW DC Weekly Review. Before I get into this week's reviews, I just want to specify that there will be spoilers throughout this video. The first episode I want to discuss this week is Supergirl Season 2, Episode 13, Mr. and Mrs. Mizzy Spicklet. This episode is the Valentine's Day episode for this season. Granted, they came a week late. You'd think that they would have scheduled this a little bit better, but it is here, and if you remember from the end of the last episode, Kara and Mon-El were about to share their first romantic moment with one another when they were interrupted by Mr. Mixie Spicklet. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Probably not, so for this portion of the review, I'm going to refer to him as Mr. M. Just makes things easier for me. And what we learn in this episode is that Mr. M is from the 5th dimension. He is kind of an imp. He's kind of a trickster. He deals with magic. What is interesting in this episode is that Mon-El is kind of familiar with this type of alien. He's dealt with his like on Daxam before, and what we kind of learned about Mon-El in this episode is that he kind of has a bit of an anger streak with him, a bit of a mean streak in him when it comes to dealing with certain adversaries, especially in this case with Mr. M, who he kind of feels jealous about. We see him deal with him in a rather violent way, and it doesn't really end up working for him. It also creates a lot of friction with Kara, who we know by now is a little bit more benevolent when it comes to dealing with her adversaries. Not all the time, but if there is a more benevolent solution to the problem, she's gonna go with that versus the easier, more aggressive, more violent version of that. But in the end, we find out that the way to banish Mr. M back to the 5th dimension is to get him to say his name backwards. And I thought it was really cool that we got to see the Fortress of Solitude again. I really like when they bring that set back in. I just love that connection to Superman. And I thought that was a really cool sequence at the end where she kind of tricks him into doing it, but we all know that he couldn't stick around forever. But I have a feeling he's going to be back just because you can't really get rid of him. He always ends up popping up, especially in the comics. But also in this episode, we got to see Winn kind of have a little bit of a romance. He meets this alien at the alien bar, Lyra, and he kind of starts a relationship with her, and she is kind of dealing with kind of the alien backlash, you know, they're kind of afraid to be out in public. She's kind of afraid to get in any type of romantic relationship with anyone, have any type of attachment because of her physical appearance. It's once again a really interesting theme that they're utilizing through the alien population on this show. This idea of isolation, this idea of insecurity. I thought it was really well done in this episode, and we also got to see Winn kind of do stuff on his own in his personal life, which we haven't really gotten a lot of this season. But Winn was not the only one dealing with romantic issues. We also got Alex and Maggie. Alex is someone who loves Valentine's Day. Maggie hates Valentine's Day, and in a relationship, there's gonna be differences. There always are. And this was one where they kind of came together in the end, but we learned why Valentine's Day is such a sore subject for Maggie. It's linked to a very traumatic event in her life. This episode really got them closer together as a couple, really got them closer together in their relationship. I thought it was really, really well done. I really like that pair of Maggie and Alex so far this season, but I want to see them do different things. I want to see them kind of maybe team up and go on a case or something like that. Get back to kind of the more procedural stuff. I thought that was a really cool aspect to their relationship. But overall, I have to say, I rather enjoyed this episode. The next episode is The Flash Season 2, Episode 13, Attack on Gorilla City. Last week, we did not get a Flash episode, and this week we got one that I have been waiting for probably since the first time I ever saw Gorilla Grodd on the show, way back, I believe, in Season 1, and especially last year when we got to see him be banished to Gorilla City. And in this episode, we finally get to see Gorilla City. As we learned from the previous Flash episode, he has lured Harrison Wells there, and the Flash and certain members of his team have to go and rescue him. And what we learn in this episode is things are not what they appear to be when it comes to the reason why Gorilla Grodd has them brought to Gorilla City. Gorilla Grodd surprisingly tricks Barry and Team Flash, and he really wants the Flash there just to defeat and humiliate his main opponent in Gorilla City, Solovar. And once that happens, Gorilla Grodd rules over all the gorillas, and his master plan is to get them to Central City and wreak havoc. And that's why he wanted Cisco there particularly, because Cisco can get him back to our Earth, back to Central City, and really start his attack. And as we saw at the end of this episode, he wasn't able to use Cisco, but he is able to enlist Gypsy to possibly get his gorilla army to Central City. But before we get to next week's episode, there's a couple aspects of this episode I want to touch on. One is the relationship between Julian and Caitlin takes a little bit step forward in this episode, in the sense that Julian decides to dress up as Indiana Jones and accompany them on this adventure, basically for the reason to make sure Caitlin is okay, to protect her. And she kind of figured this out, and it's really obvious that Julian has feelings for Caitlin and vice versa. I've touched on this before. Also, with Jesse Quick back on our Earth, it's time for her and Wally to kind of confront each other about what type of relationship they have. Wally really wants her to stay on Earth 1 with him so they can have this kind of young romance that they're having. She obviously has probably ties to her father and whatever work she's doing on Earth 2, so it leads to an interesting kind of confrontation they have with one another. Also, a quick side note, it's really cool to see Jesse Quick and Wally West kicking some ass on screen together. That's something I kind of wanted to see happen last year, but I finally got to see it happen this year, and I'm very happy about that. So overall, I have to say I really liked this episode of The Flash. Granted, I thought the CGI was a little bit obvious when it came to the arena that they were in, and it really looked that they were straining the budget. Overall, I really liked this episode. I can't wait till next week when we're going to get some serious throwdown in Central City. But moving on to Arrow Season 5, Episode 14, titled The Sin Eater. And in this episode, we have multiple things happening, but I first want to start off with kind of the main plot of the episode, and that is Oliver having to deal with the ACU finding out, through Prometheus probably, that the Green Arrow is the one that killed Detective Malone. And in this episode, he has to deal with that, but he also has to deal with the repercussions of it, in the sense that he can't be the Green Arrow out in the open anymore and feel safe. Oliver also has to deal with the fact that his girlfriend, Susan Williams, is kind of onto him when it comes to his identity as the Green Arrow, which she directly confronts him for in this episode. Of course, he has to deny it in every way, but what is interesting is when he tells Thea about this, she kind of goes the extra mile in discouraging any of this thought by tarnishing Susan Williams' career and kind of destroying it. And it's a really kind of extreme thing that I didn't think Thea would do. Granted, she wants to protect her brother in any way she can, but this seems a little bit too much in the episode. And Oliver directly confronts her about it. What is interesting that I find about this aspect of the show is I'm really not all that positive about the relationship between Oliver and Susan, because I don't really think it developed really well at all. I thought it was rushed a little bit, and obviously we know that her motives aren't exactly pure. Also, I would think that Oliver by this point in the show would be a little bit more guarded when it comes to his personal life, especially his romantic relationship, which has gone through many iterations throughout the show. So while Oliver has to deal with all of that kind of personal turmoil, there is a jailbreak, and a few old villains are back to raise some hell, and that is China White, Cupid, and Lisa Warner. And in this episode, they're kind of the B subplot, I would say, perhaps. I mean, the Team Arrow has to deal with them, but I don't think they're really the big threat. But what that plot does do is it does really delve into things having to deal with Quentin Lance. When Liza Warner used to be a cop, someone that Quentin Lance knew, Quentin Lance dealt with before, as we saw before in the show. And in this episode, she confronts him directly about his ties to Damien Darhk. Because I think we forget how big a part of the show that plotline was, and it really comes back in this episode, and I think it's something that's going to haunt Quentin Lance for a very long time, especially the personal ties between Damien Darhk and what happened to his daughter. Also in this episode, we're back to the Bratva flashbacks, and what we find out is that there's kind of a power struggle going on within the Bratva, kind of a little civil war within it. Oliver kind of has chosen his side, and we see how dangerous the side he has chosen is. But we also have to remember is that we've seen both Oliver and the Bratva person that he is protecting in the modern timeline. So we know that they don't die in the flashbacks, but I still think it's a really cool aspect of this season. I'll say it again, the flashbacks have been the best they've been in years. But the biggest thing that happened at the end of this episode is that it gets out to the public that the Green Arrow is the one that killed Detective Malone, and that Oliver Queen and his administration covered it up. And if that is believed to be true by the public, that's going to lead to a lot of ramifications when it comes to Oliver and his term as mayor. So overall, I have to say it was a decent episode of Arrow. I liked the stuff when it came to advancing the overall plot of the season. The other stuff was kind of cool, but it was mostly kind of a villain of the week type stuff. Moving on now to Legends of Tomorrow Season 2, Episode 12, Camelot/3000. In this episode, we are reintroduced to the JSA, well, at least a few members of the JSA and what they've been up to. Apparently, they have put it upon themselves to protect the Spear of Destiny throughout time. We see in the year 3000 where Dr. Midnight is protecting a certain part of the Spear, and he's of course attacked by the Legion of Doom, and then we go back in time to maybe not something that's quite historical, but more kind of legendary in the court of King Arthur and Camelot and his Knights of the Round Table. And it was kind of a really cool thing to see that in this episode because it feels so comic booky. In the court of Camelot, we see that Stargirl has traveled there to protect a piece of the Spear of Destiny, and we see that the Legion of Doom, of course, also wants that piece, as well as the Legends. And what this leads to is a really cool medieval episode of Legends of Tomorrow where we see our characters don some really cool medieval garb, try to speak in medieval speak. It almost feels like a Renaissance fair at times in this episode, and I couldn't help but find myself very entertained by the whole aspect of it, especially at one point where Ray designs a sword that is essentially a lightsaber, and he has this big fight with Damien Darhk. Overall, I have to say I had a lot of fun with the episode, and as odd as it is at times, it is advancing the overall plot of the show, which I have to give a lot of credit for the episodes for doing that, even though they're doing it in this crazy comic book type manner. I definitely continue to enjoy Legends of Tomorrow. Granted, I feel that it is the lesser of the other shows, but you kind of have to respect it for how fun it is. This has been the CW DC TV weekly review. If you like this video, please check out the other videos on my channel.